Picture this: a world where rivers weren't just water, but gods, where every ripple and current carried the whispers of the divine, and civilizations bowed not to kings or temples, but to the flowing, life-giving power of these sacred waters. From the Nile to the Ganges, from the Tigris to the Amazon, ancient cultures saw rivers as living deities, embodiments of creation, destruction, and renewal. They built altars along their banks, offered sacrifices to their depths, and wove their myths into the very fabric of existence. But somewhere along the way, something shifted. These elemental beings, once worshipped as the heart of spirituality, faded into the background of history. How did we go from seeing rivers as divine to treating them as mere resources? And what does that loss of reverence mean for us today? This isn't just a story about forgotten gods, it's a mirror held up to our own relationship with the natural world. The decline of river deities tracks a deeper cultural shift, one where spirituality became untangled from the land, where the sacred was pulled out of the water and placed somewhere distant, abstract. But the echoes of that ancient reverence still linger. You can hear it in the way we speak of rivers as mighty or wild, in the unease we feel when they flood or dry up, as if some unspoken pact has been broken. And perhaps most strikingly, you can see it in the way our modern ecological crises mirror the warnings of those old myths, stories of rivers drying up when disrespected, of floods unleashed as punishment. The past, it seems, is whispering to us, so let's follow that whisper back to its source. Over the course of this journey, we'll trace the cultural fall of these elemental deities, from their golden age of worship to their slow fade into legend. We'll explore how empires rose and fell by their grace, how religions shifted and rewrote their roles, and how the very idea of the sacred changed shape. And by the end, you might just find yourself looking at rivers and the natural world with older, wiser eyes, because this isn't just about mythology. It's about what we've lost, what we've forgotten, and whether there's still time to listen to the water before it stops speaking altogether. Long before rivers were mapped or dammed, they were sung into existence not just as water, but as gods. Take the Ganges, known to ancient Hindus as goddess Ganga, descending from the heavens in a torrent of sacred hair, tangled in the locks of Lord Shiva. The Rigveda calls her the mother of all, her waters not just cleansing the body but washing away lifetimes of sin. Or the Nile, worshipped as Happy, the blue-skinned deity whose annual floods were greeted with festivals and offerings of bread, because when Happy smiled, Egypt feasted for a year. These weren't poetic metaphors, they were literal truths shaping entire civilizations. Farmers planted by their moods, kings claimed legitimacy through their favor, and temples rose where the water touched the land. What's striking is how these river gods embodied duality, both gentle and terrible. The Tigris and Euphrates, personified as the gods Enki and Tiamat in Mesopotamian myths, gave Babylon its fertile crescent but could also drown cities without warning. Herodotus wrote of the Nile's floods with awe, noting how Egyptians saw the river's rage as divine retribution for human arrogance. Even the Celts along the Rhine left swords and cauldrons in the water, gifts to deities who could heal wounds or drag the unwary under in an instant. This wasn't superstition, it was acute observation. Ancient peoples understood something we've forgotten. Rivers don't just sustain life, they demand respect. The rituals around them reveal a profound intimacy. In India, devotees still release floating lamps into the Ganges during Diwali, an echo of ancient fire offerings described in the Mahabharata. The Aztecs believed the goddess Chalchudlaqu drowned the world in her tears when humans grew corrupt, a warning etched into their creation myths. These stories weren't just folklore, they were ecological contracts. By tying morality to the river's health, cultures encoded conservation into their spirituality. Polluting a river wasn't just careless, it was blasphemy. But then something changed. As empires grew, so did their need to control rather than worship. The Romans, masters of aqueducts, began to speak of rivers as boundaries to cross or resources to harness. Philosophy shifted from seeing nature as alive to seeing it as inert, something to be measured and mastered. The gods didn't vanish overnight, of course. You can still find villagers along the Mekong leaving rice offerings for the Naga spirits, but their power waned, relegated to folklore as temples gave way to trading posts. The water still flowed, but the divine whisper within it grew faint, and with that silence came a dangerous idea that rivers belonged to us rather than the other way around. Rivers didn't just flow through the land, they flowed through the cosmos itself. In the oldest myths, they weren't merely water. They were the veins of creation, the boundaries between life and death, the visible threads stitching the divine to the earthly. Take the Mesopotamian Abzu, the primordial freshwater ocean beneath the earth, where the god Enki drew wisdom like water from a well. To drink from it wasn't just to quench thirst, it was to taste the secrets of existence. Or the Greek Oceanus, a titan whose body encircled the world, his currents marking the edge of the known universe. These weren't just stories, they were maps of meaning, ways of understanding humanity's place in something vast and ancient. Art tells the same tale. In Egyptian tomb paintings, the Nile twists like a serpent through the underworld, its waters a ladder for souls ascending to the afterlife. Hindu temple carvings show the Ganges cascading from Shiva's hair, not just as a river but as a bridge between heaven and earth. Even the Vikings believed the Milky Way was the reflection of their great river, Ilivaga, its icy waters birthing the first giants. These depictions weren't decoration, they were declarations. A river could be a womb, a judge, a messenger, a god. Yet today, we chart rivers as lines on maps, measure their flow in cubic meters, debate their ownership in courtrooms. The shift is staggering. Where ancient sailors saw the Danube as the home of river spirits, modern engineers see hydropower potential. The Colorado River, once the lifeblood of Pueblo creation stories, now dwindles in its bed, diverted to fill swimming pools and water golf courses. It's not just that we've stopped worshipping rivers, we've stopped seeing them except as tools. And here's the haunting question. When a river becomes a resource instead of a revelation, what vanishes? The answer whispers in the cracks of drought-stricken riverbeds, in the dead zones where polluted waters no longer sustain life. The old myths warned of this. The Babylonian epic Enuma Elish tells of the gods punishing humanity with floods when they forgot their place in the natural order. The Aztecs believed Chalchudlacu's wrath came not from cruelty, but from broken reciprocity. These weren't arbitrary lessons, they were ecological wisdom dressed in sacred garb. The forces that unraveled these beliefs were many: empires hungry for control, religions that lifted gods into the sky, philosophies that split spirit from soil. But the most corrosive idea was the simplest, that rivers, and by extension all nature, were ours to command. Yet the water remembers. When a river floods a city or vanishes into the sand, it's not malice. It's the echo of an old truth, one we're still learning to hear. That divinity wasn't just in the heavens, but in the current, the silt, the rain. And if we listen closely, the past might still have something to teach us. The rise of monotheism didn't just change who people worshipped, it rewrote the entire relationship between humanity and the natural world. In the ancient pantheons, gods lived in the trees, the storms, the rivers. But with religions like Christianity and Islam, divinity became singular, distant, untouchable, a god above nature, not within it. Theologians like Augustine of Hippo argued that the divine was entirely separate from the material world, framing the old elemental deities as false idols or even demons. Rivers, once seen as living gods, were now just water, beautiful perhaps, but no longer sacred. This shift wasn't just philosophical, it was political. When Christianity spread across Europe, missionaries didn't simply erase pagan beliefs, they repurposed them. Sacred springs became baptismal fonts, river deities were rebranded as saints. The Celtic goddess Brigid, associated with holy wells, was folded into Saint Brigid. The Danube, once home to water spirits, was now just a river to be crossed in the name of Christ. Even the Ganges, though still revered in Hinduism, was dismissed by early Muslim chroniclers as mere superstition. The message was clear: the divine no longer flowed in the currents. It lived in the heavens, far beyond the reach of mortal hands. But this new worldview came with consequences. If rivers weren't gods, they could be owned. If they weren't sacred, they could be exploited. Theologians like Thomas Aquinas argued that nature existed to serve humanity, a stark contrast to the old belief that humans served the rivers. By the Middle Ages, Europe's waterways were being dammed for mills, diverted for irrigation, treated not as living entities but as resources. The Islamic world, though more advanced in hydrology, still saw rivers as channels of Allah's bounty, to be managed wisely but unquestionably used. Yet the old beliefs never fully died. In rural villages, offerings were still left at springs. Fishermen whispered prayers to forgotten spirits before casting their nets. The tension between old and new simmered beneath the surface, sometimes literally. When drought struck, some communities still blamed the anger of displaced river gods, not the whims of a distant deity. The past had a way of resurfacing, like water finding its own path, and that's where the real fracture happened. Monotheism didn't just remove gods from the rivers, it removed the idea of reciprocity. No longer did humans owe the water anything. No longer was pollution a sin against a deity, it was just bad hygiene. The rivers, stripped of their divinity, became silent. But nature has a way of speaking, even when we stop listening. The floods, the droughts, the dying fish, they're not punishments from an angry God. They're the echoes of an old truth, one we're still learning to hear, that some things were sacred for a reason. If the rise of monotheism pulled the gods out of the rivers, the scientific revolution drained the last drops of magic from them entirely. Thinkers like René Descartes didn't just study nature, they declared it a machine. His famous split between mind and matter reduced the world to mere mechanics, where rivers weren't deities or even living things, but clockwork systems of hydraulics and gravity. Isaac Newton's laws of motion, though groundbreaking, framed the universe as a grand equation, its mysteries not sacred but solvable. The Ganges wasn't a goddess anymore, she was a volume of water moving at a calculable speed. The Nile's floods weren't Happy's blessings, they were predictable cycles of rainfall and erosion. Knowledge, once a form of communion with the divine, became a tool of domination. The language of the time tells the story. Francis Bacon wrote that nature should be bound into service and hounded in her wanderings. For him, rivers weren't to be worshipped but harnessed, their currents forced to turn wheels rather than inspire prayers. Industrialists took this to heart. By the 18th century, Europe's rivers were corseted with mills, their banks lined with factories that dumped dyes and chemicals into waters once considered inviolable. The River Irwell in England, sacred to pre-Celtic tribes, became so polluted it was said a person could tell the color of the week's fabric production just by looking at the water. Progress, it seemed, had a price, and the rivers paid it. Yet not everyone embraced this cold calculus. The Romantic poets pushed back hard. William Blake raged against the dark satanic mills choking England's rivers, while Wordsworth wrote of the Wye as a living presence, a sublime force that stirred the soul. Even scientists like Alexander von Humboldt warned that reducing nature to numbers risked severing humanity's emotional ties to it, but the tide had turned. Industry needed rivers to be inert, predictable, profitable. The old stories of vengeful water spirits seemed like childish superstitions until the rivers began to rebel in their own way. The environmental costs of this mindset were swift and brutal. London's Thames became a festering sewer, its Great Stink of 1858 so unbearable Parliament had to suspend sessions. In America, the Cuyahoga River caught fire repeatedly from oil slicks, a literal burning of bridges with the past. These weren't just accidents, they were symptoms of a civilization that had forgotten how to see water as anything but a servant. The irony, early scientists like Paracelsus had once spoken of rivers as the blood of the earth, echoing the very ancient wisdom the Enlightenment dismissed. And so we're left with a question sharper than any factory smokestack. Did we have to strip rivers of their sacredness to master them? Or was there another path, one where turbines and temples could have coexisted? The answer might lie in the cracks of our current crises, in the dead zones and the drying deltas, because the rivers never stopped being powerful. We just stopped remembering they were alive. Colonialism didn't just redraw maps, it rewrote the sacred. When European ships landed on distant shores, they brought more than flags and muskets. They carried a worldview that saw rivers as property, not living gods. In the Americas, Spanish conquistadors dismissed Aztec ceremonies honoring Chalchutlicue as pagan nonsense, even as they diverted her waters to build their own cities. Jesuit missionaries along the Mississippi scorned the Dakota people's offerings to Untehai, the serpentine water spirit, calling their rituals devil worship. But these weren't just cultural clashes, they were ecological ruptures. Indigenous taboos against overfishing or polluting rivers weren't arbitrary rules, they were sacred contracts with the divine. Dismantle the belief and the protection vanished with it. Africa's waterways suffered a similar fate. The Niger River, revered by the Bambara as the home of the ancestral Nomo spirits, became a shipping lane for French colonial traders. British engineers in India dismissed the Ganges' spiritual significance as they built bridges and sewage lines, treating her as a glorified canal. In Australia, Aboriginal Dreamtime stories of the rainbow serpent, a creator being who carved rivers into the land, were mocked as childish myths, even as settlers drained sacred billabongs for cattle ranches. The pattern was universal: first disenchant the water, then dominate it. Yet some communities refused to let their rivers be silenced. The Maori of New Zealand fought for over a century to have the Wanganui River recognized as a legal person, a living ancestor with rights equal to humans. In Bolivia, after centuries of suppression, Aymara rituals honoring Pachamama, the Earth Mother who gives water, were written into national law, granting nature legal standing. These weren't just victories for indigenous rights, they were cracks in the colonial mindset, proof that the sacred could resurface. And here's the bitter irony: the very rivers colonial powers tried to tame are now among the most threatened. The Colorado River, stripped of Pueblo prayers, is a ghost of its former self. The Niger, choked by plastic and oil spills, no longer sings with the Namo's presence. When we severed the spiritual ties that protected these waters, we didn't just lose stories, we lost safeguards. The droughts, the pollution, the dying ecosystems, they're not just environmental failures. They're the consequences of a world that forgot how to listen. So what happens when a river's sacredness is erased? the answer flows through every dammed watershed, every poisoned delta. Because a river stripped of its divinity becomes a resource to exploit, not a life to cherish. And perhaps that's the most urgent lesson echoing from the past, that reverence wasn't just about worship, it was survival. The Romantics looked at rivers and saw not just water, but wonder. At the height of the Industrial Revolution, as factories blackened the skies and polluted the streams, poets and painters launched a rebellion, not with protests but with pigments and sonnets. William Wordsworth's lines, composed a few miles above Tintern Abbey, didn't just describe the River Wye, it breathed life into it, calling its waters the guardian of my heart and soul slash of all my moral being. For Wordsworth, the river wasn't a resource, it was a companion, a teacher, a force that could mend the fractures of modern life. J.M.W. Turner's swirling canvases went further, capturing the Thames not as a commercial highway but as a luminous mystery, its surface alive with storm light and shadow, as if the river itself were dreaming. This was more than nostalgia, it was an attempt to re-enchant what science and industry had stripped bare. The Romantics didn't just paint rivers, they baptized them in moonlight and mist, framing them as portals to the sublime. In Germany, Caspar David Friedrich's landscapes showed solitary figures dwarfed by roaring waterfalls, their tiny forms a testament to nature's terrifying grandeur. Even Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, often remembered for its monster, is steeped in alpine rivers described with near-religious awe, places where the mighty Alps, whose white and shining pyramids and domes towered above all, as belonging to another Earth. The message was clear, rivers weren't just part of the scenery, they were the soul of the world, yet for all its beauty, Romanticism's re-enchantment had limits. The movement was a candle flickering against the gale of progress. Turner might paint the Thames as a celestial ribbon, but outside his studio, the real Thames choked on sewage and industrial waste. Wordsworth's verses couldn't stop the mills from damming the Lake District streams. The Romantics offered awe but not accountability, a feast for the imagination that left the actual rivers unfed. Their reverence was aesthetic, not ancestral. They admired nature's beauty without restoring its sacredness, or, it turns out, isn't the same as devotion. And that's the tension at the heart of Romanticism. It gave rivers back their majesty but not their meaning. A Turner painting might move you to tears, but would it stop you from dumping waste into the water? The Romantics awakened emotions but not ethics. Their rivers were sublime, yet somehow still separate objects of admiration rather than subjects of respect. By the time Friedrich's wanderers gazed upon those misty waterfalls, the Rhine was already being straightened for barges, the Danube's myths drowned in the hum of steamships. Which leaves us with an uneasy question: can beauty alone save what belief once protected? The Romantics proved that art could make us feel the loss of the sacred, but not how to reclaim it. Their legacy is a paradox, a testament to the power of awe, and a warning about its limits, because even as they wrote and painted, the machines kept grinding, the rivers kept darkening, and the 20th century loomed, a time when nature wouldn't just be disenchanted. It would be disposable. Modernity didn't just change how we use rivers, it changed what they are. Gone are the days when waterways were deities or even neighbors. Today, they're inventory. Dams turn them into power generators, bottling plants treat them as commodities, and privatization schemes auction their flows to the highest bidder. Take the Colorado River, once the lifeblood of the Hopi and Navajo creation stories. Now its waters are divvied up by legal agreements so precise they account for every drop, leaving its delta a parched wasteland. Or the Ganges, where pilgrims still bathe in her sacred currents, even as tanneries dump chromium into her veins, turning devotion into a dangerous act. The message is clear. In the modern world, a river's value is measured in megawatts and profit margins, not myths or miracles, but the backlash has begun. From New Zealand to India, a quiet revolution is unfolding, one that seeks to restore rivers not just ecologically, but legally. In 2017, the Wanganui River became the first in the world to be granted legal personhood, a recognition rooted in Maori belief that the river is an ancestor. Ecuador followed, enshrining the rights of nature in its constitution. Even the Ganges, despite her pollution, was briefly declared a living entity by an Indian court in 2017, a nod to her ancient sacred status. These aren't just legal maneuvers, they're spiritual rebellions, attempts to stitch the divine back into the water's flow. Yet the obstacles are staggering. Corporate interests fight these measures at every turn, arguing that personhood for rivers would cripple industry. Farmers in California's Central Valley, dependent on diverted Colorado River water, scoff at the idea of rights for a resource they see as theirs by contract. Even well-meaning environmentalists sometimes struggle to reconcile ancient reverence with modern economics. Can a river be both a deity and a reservoir? Can it power cities and still command worship? Perhaps the answer lies in the spaces between. In Colombia, the Atrato River's legal personhood was granted not through Western law alone, but by blending indigenous cosmology with court rulings. In Bangladesh, the Turag River's rights were affirmed by citing both hydrological science and Hindu texts. These cases suggest a third way, one where dams and devotion might coexist, where water is both resource and relative. The deeper question isn't just whether we can resacralize rivers, but whether we can resacralize ourselves. The Ojibwe prophecy of the Black Snake, a pipeline threatening their sacred waters, warns that harming the river is harming our own future. The irony is thick. The very systems that disenchanted nature now face collapse from its degradation. Maybe that's why the old rituals are returning. From Celtic water blessings revived along the Thames to Hindu river weddings meant to purify the Yamuna, people are reaching back to the past to salvage the future. Because if modernity taught us anything, it's this: a river stripped of its soul can still drown us not in water but in consequences, and so the currents twist again. Scientists now speak of environmental personhood, a term that would have baffled Descartes but would have made perfect sense to the Aztecs. Urban planners design daylighting projects to free buried streams, as if unshackling imprisoned spirits. Even the languages shifting rivers are no longer it, but they. The sacred wasn't erased, it was buried, and like water, it always finds a way back. The whispers of river deities never fully faded, they just changed form. Today, a growing wave of neo-pagan and ecological spirituality is stitching the sacred back into the water's flow. Along the banks of the polluted Yamuna in India, Hindu priests now lead river weddings, marrying the goddess Yamuna to Lord Krishna in symbolic ceremonies meant to restore her purity. In Britain, modern druids perform water blessings at the source of the Thames, invoking the Celtic goddess Tameses with chants and biodegradable offerings. These aren't just rituals, they're acts of resistance, blending worship with activism in ways that would have made ancient river cults proud. What's striking is how these movements bridge ancient reverence and modern urgency. Eco-pagans in the Pacific Northwest organize spiritual clean-ups, hauling trash from the Duwamish River while singing to the salmon spirits once honored by local tribes. Scholars like Dr. Bron Taylor call this dark green religion, a faith where nature isn't just protected but revered as intrinsically divine. For practitioners, it's not about nostalgia, it's about accountability. As Lakota elder Avo Looking Horse puts it, When you pray with the river, not just for it, you remember you're part of its story, not its owner. Yet the challenges loom large. Can a water blessing in Glastonbury scale to heal the Mississippi's dead zones? Can Ganges activists fighting tanneries with lawsuits and prayers outpace industrial pollution? The tension is palpable. These revivals thrive in local pockets but collide with global systems built on extraction. Still, there's power in the attempt. When Maori elders won legal personhood for the Wanganui River, they didn't just cite treaties, they brought ancestral chants into the courtroom, insisting the river's voice be heard. The result, a precedent rippling worldwide, from Bangladesh's Turag River to Florida's threatened springs. And this is where art slips in, not as decoration, but as defiance. Murals of river goddesses bloom on urban concrete, protest songs weave hydrology with hymnody, and poets reframe polluted waters as wounded deities begging for healing. The next chapter of this story isn't just about policy or science, it's about imagination, because to save a river, you must first remember it can be sacred. Stories have always been the lifeblood of meaning, and nowhere is that clearer than in the way modern art and media are breathing magic back into rivers. Take Studio Ghibli's Spirited Away, where the polluted river spirit Haku isn't just a character, he's a cry for remembrance. Covered in sludge and forgotten by humans, his transformation back into a dragon isn't just a plot twist, it's a mirror held up to our own polluted waterways. The film's bathhouse, where spirits come to rejuvenate, echoes ancient Japanese beliefs that rivers were portals to other realms. Director Hayao Miyazaki didn't just make a movie, he crafted a modern myth, one where cleaning a river spirit becomes an act of redemption. Literature weaves similar spells. In The Water Knife, Paolo Bacigalupi paints a dystopian future where the Colorado River has dried up, framing its loss as a spiritual apocalypse as much as an environmental one. Indigenous authors like Tommy Orange There and Leslie Marmon's Silko Ceremony thread river myths into contemporary narratives, showing how ancestral stories still pulse beneath urban concrete. Even children's books like The River by Stian Hole use dreamlike illustrations to personify waterways as wise, wandering giants. These works don't just describe rivers, they animate them, turning water back into a character with agency, voice, and sacredness. Music, too, carries this current. The Maori Waiata songs for the Wanganui River aren't performances. They're karakia prayers that remind listeners the river is an ancestor. Folk singers like Anani's Mitchell weave ballads about drowned rivers, while hip-hop artists like Taboo from the Black Eyed Peas collaborate with tribal elders to mix beats with water blessings. These sounds aren't just art, they're sonic rituals using rhythm to reconnect what industrialization severed. But here's the real magic. These stories aren't just reflecting change, they're catalyzing it. After Spirited Away's release, Japanese activists cited Haku's plight in campaigns to clean the country's rivers. The 2016 documentary Damnation didn't just critique hydropower, it revived indigenous tales of rivers as living beings, helping fuel the movement to remove obsolete dams. Even video games like Never Alone, based on Inupiat lore, teach players to see ice and water as kin. The pattern is undeniable. When logic and laws fail to protect rivers, stories step in. Yet for all their power, these narratives face a tidal wave of opposition. Corporate lobbyists dismiss them as sentimentalism, while policymakers often prioritize data over dreams. But the science itself is starting to side with the storytellers. Studies show that people who engage with nature through art or mythology are more likely to support conservation, not out of fear but love. That emotional shift is key. You can frighten someone into recycling, but you can't frighten them into reverence. Which brings us to the courtroom, where the battle over river rights is testing whether stories can reshape systems. When the Wanganui Maori brought chants into legal hearings, they weren't just presenting evidence, they were re-enchanting the law itself. The judges didn't just rule, they listened, recognizing that some truths flowed deeper than statutes. Now, as artists and activists join forces, the question isn't just whether stories can revive rivers, it's whether they can remake the world. In 2017, something extraordinary happened. A river went to court. Not just any river, but New Zealand's Wanganui, the ancestral heart of the Maori people. After a legal battle spanning 140 years, the Wanganui became the first river in the world granted legal personhood, recognized as an indivisible and living whole with rights equivalent to a human. The ruling wasn't just a legal milestone, it was a cultural earthquake. For the Maori, who have long understood the river as Te Awatupua, a living ancestor, the decision wasn't innovation but affirmation. As Maori elder Gerard Albert put it, "We've always known the river has a soul, now the law finally agrees." The legal arguments hinged on a radical fusion of indigenous cosmology and Western jurisprudence. The Wanganui's personhood includes two guardians, one appointed by the government, one by the Maori, embodying a dual stewardship that mirrors the river's physical and spiritual dimensions. Fines for harming the river aren't just penalties, they're utu, a concept akin to restorative justice, where compensation must heal not just the water but the relationship with it. This isn't legal theory, it's living tradition. Maori activists spent decades presenting evidence that wasn't just scientific but Whakapapa genealogical records showing their kinship with the river, stretching back to creation itself. Similar victories followed. Ecuador's constitution, rewritten in 2008, granted nature the right to exist, persist, and regenerate. India's Ganges and Yamuna rivers were briefly recognized as living entities in 2017, though the ruling was later stayed, with judges citing Hindu texts that describe rivers as goddesses. Even in the United States, the Yurok tribe declared the Klamath River a legal person in 2019, invoking tribal law that predates the Constitution. These cases share a thread. They're not just protecting rivers, they're repersonifying them, undoing centuries of legal abstraction that turned water into a thing. Yet the challenges are as deep as the rivers themselves. How do you enforce the rights of a waterway when those rights clash with farms, cities, and industries? New Zealand's model offers clues. The Wanganui's guardians can sue on its behalf, and development projects now require the river's consent, assessed through cultural and environmental impact studies. But elsewhere, the gap between law and practice yawns wide. In India, the Ganges remains polluted despite her legal status, bogged down by bureaucracy and competing demands. In Ecuador, mining companies often ignore nature's rights, betting correctly that enforcement will lag. The tension between ancient belief and modern law raises a provocative question. Is legal personhood the next chapter of river reverence, or just a pale echo of what was lost? For indigenous communities, these rulings are a homecoming, a chance to restore covenants broken by colonization. For Western legal systems, they're a seismic shift, challenging the very notion that nature is property. But perhaps the most surprising outcome is the grassroots ripple effect. From Oregon to Bangladesh, ordinary citizens are citing these cases to block dams and pollution, armed with a new argument: rivers aren't just resources. They're relatives, and that's where the real transformation begins, not in courtrooms but in communities. Along the banks of the Wanganui, children now learn the river's legal name alongside its Maori chants. In Colombia, where the Atrato River won rights in 2016, fishermen monitor its health as if tending to an elder. these aren't just policies, they're rituals rewiring how people see the water they depend on. Because when a river becomes a who instead of a what, everything changes. The next wave of activism isn't fighting for nature's protection, it's fighting for its voice. And if history's any guide, once that voice is heard, it's impossible to unhear. Now consider this: what happens when reverence isn't just celebrated in temples, but enshrined in law? The answer is flowing through 100 battles worldwide, where people are demanding that rivers sit not just in the pantheon, but at the bargaining table. And as those currents converge, they're carving a new path, one where the sacred isn't just remembered, but written into the bedrock of how we live. At Standing Rock, the protest signs didn't just say, "Stop the pipeline," they said, "Water is life." For the Sioux and their allies, the battle against the Dakota Access Pipeline wasn't just about environmental policy, it was a spiritual stand. Elder LaDonna Brave Bull Allard called the Missouri River our grandmother, a living relative whose veins fed not just bodies but souls. When thousands camped in the snow, their prayers weren't political theater. They were the same offerings once made to river deities, now carried on picket signs instead of clay bowls. What unfolded there wasn't just activism, it was ceremony. Protesters smudged with sage before facing bulldozers, sang centuries-old water songs at riot police, and described visions of black snakes, a prophecy echoing the serpentine water spirits of their ancestors. The parallels were uncanny. Just as ancient priests guarded sacred rivers from defilement, these water protectors formed human chains against oil drills. Extinction Rebellion marches tell a similar story. In London, activists perform die-ins dressed as river spirits, their blue-painted bodies sprawled across financial districts like drowned deities. A protester in Brazil wears a crown of plastic bottles, embodying the polluted Orinoco as both victim and avenger. These aren't just costumes, they're modern-day theophanies, the gods of old returning as street theater. When a young organizer in Minneapolis told reporters, "We're not saving the Mississippi, she's saving us," she wasn't speaking metaphorically. She was channeling a world older than colonialism, one that never severed the bond between humans and waterways. The kinship runs deeper than symbolism. Take Autumn Peltier, the Anishinaabe water activist who at 14 addressed the United Nations with a trembling voice and unshakable truth. No one should have to worry if the water will kill them. Her words didn't come from textbooks but from her people's teachings that water is the first medicine. Or the Maori grandmothers who patrol New Zealand's polluted harbors, testing toxicity levels while chanting Karakia to the ocean. These aren't just guardians, they're living bridges between ancient reverence and modern crisis. What's striking is how these movements revive protector roles once thought extinct. In pre-Christian Europe, river wardens enforced taboos against dumping waste in sacred waters. Hindu purification rites doubled as sanitation laws, with penalties for polluting the Ganges. Today's water protectors inherit that mantle, blending protest with priesthood. The difference, where ancient rituals aim to appease gods, today's activists demand accountability from corporations. Yet the essence remains: both see rivers not as property but as kin. And here's where the myth-making begins. When Standing Rock's Protect Our Water campaign went viral, it didn't just spread information, it spread a narrative. TikTok videos of drum circles at pipeline sites became digital campfires, retelling the story of resistance for a new generation. Murals of water protectors now grace city walls from Berlin to Bogota, their imagery echoing cave paintings of river spirits. The icons are evolving. The goddess Chalchutlikyu might wear a gas mask now, but her message is the same. This resurgence hinges on education, not the dry facts of hydrology, but the living stories that make water sacred again. Indigenous-led schools from Canada to Australia teach children river songs before chemistry equations. University courses on ecological humanities explore how myths shape conservation. Even children's books like We Are Water Protectors distill ancient truths into bedtime stories. The lesson is clear: to change how we treat rivers, we must first change how we remember them. Because the old myths never really died, they just went underground, like buried streams waiting to be daylighted. Now, as water protectors kneel in prayer on pipeline sites and lawyers cite tribal creation stories in courtrooms, those stories are bubbling back up. Not as relics, but as roadmaps, the question isn't whether we're making new mythology, it's whether we're finally listening to the oldest one. What if every child's first science lesson began with a story, not of molecules and formulas, but of gods and rivers? In New Zealand, that's exactly what's happening. Schools along the Wanganui River teach students to introduce themselves not just by name, but by their connection to the water, reciting the Maori whakapapa that binds them to the river's flow. Across the globe, educators are waking up to a radical idea: that ecology isn't just about facts, but faithfulness, a way of seeing the world where water isn't just H2O, but a living ancestor. Take the River Guardians program in British Columbia, where kids don waders to test water quality. But first, they hear the Salish story of the salmon spirit who taught humans to care for the streams. In India's Kerala, school gardens include sacred ponds, where students learn botany alongside the legend of the goddess Bhagavathi, who blessed the waters with healing herbs. These programs aren't replacing science with myth, they're weaving them together, showing children that data and devotion can flow side by side. The results: studies show students in these programs outperform peers in environmental literacy tests, and more strikingly, they're 3 times more likely to intervene when they see someone polluting. Yet the real transformation happens beyond test scores. When Navajo third graders in Arizona spend afternoons building miniature watershed models while elders recount how the hero twin warriors freed the rivers from monsters, they're not just learning hydrology, they're inheriting a covenant. In Norway, teachers use Sami joik songs about glacial rivers to explain climate change, turning abstract warming trends into the lament of a melting ice spirit. This is education as remembering, putting back together what colonial curricula tore apart: the idea that knowledge isn't just stored in textbooks, but in the current song. But can storytelling really mend centuries of disconnection? The evidence whispers yes. In Oregon's Creek Voices initiative, middle schoolers interview tribal historians about local rivers before designing restoration projects. The kids who hear how the Umpqua people once left offerings for the steelhead trout become fierce advocates for dam removals, not because they're told to, but because they've met the river as a character in their community's story. Psychologists call this narrative empathy, the ability to care deeply when facts become lived experience. It's why a 7th grader in Michigan, after learning Anishinaabe water prayers, organized a class campaign to ban plastic bottles, not for extra credit, but because, as she told the principal, you don't sell your grandmother in vending machines. The challenge now is scale. While boutique programs thrive, most schools still teach rivers as lifeless lines on maps, their sacredness scrubbed away like silt from a dammed reservoir. But the tide may be turning. California recently approved a K-12 Indigenous ecology framework, and Finland's national curriculum includes water kinship, lessons where students trace their local brook's path like a family tree. Even tech is joining the current. Augmented reality apps let kids see the river spirits their ancestors described, merging augmented reality with age-old reverence. And that's where the next wave begins, because the children singing to the Ganges today will soon be the engineers designing her filtration plants, the lawyers arguing for her rights, the artists painting her dreams. They'll wield drones and drum circles, water sensors and wisdom tales. The sacred doesn't vanish when it meets the modern, it adapts. Just ask the 6th graders in Seattle who built a rain garden while listening to Duwamish creation stories, their shovels turning soil as elders hummed the river's true name. Which leaves us with a shimmering possibility that the stories we plant in children now will become the laws, the technologies, the revolutions of tomorrow. Not as a return to some imagined past, but as a remembering that the future was always meant to flow both ways. A teenager in Tokyo holds up their phone, and through the screen, the murky Sumida River ripples back to life, not as polluted water, but as the dragon god Ryujin, his scales glinting with each piece of trash they virtually remove from his body. This isn't fantasy. It's River Guardians, an augmented reality game that turns cleanup missions into quests to heal a deity. Meanwhile, in Peru, indigenous elders partner with developers to create VR experiences where users don headsets and stand beside the Amazon's Yakumama, the serpent mother of waters, learning her stories while sensors track real-time deforestation data. Technology, once accused of alienating us from nature, is now being wielded like a digital prayer wheel attempting to spin the sacred back into how we see rivers. But can an app truly restore reverence? Critics argue it risks reducing spirituality to a swipeable commodity Tinder for river gods, where devotion is gamified into points and badges. When a Minnesota museum created a VR ceremony letting users offer virtual corn to the Mississippi, tribal leaders called it disrespectful, a hollow pantomime of traditions that demand physical presence and accountability. Yet other communities disagree. The Maori-designed app Owa uses geolocation to send alerts when users near the Wanganui River, prompting them to hear ancestral chants tied to that exact bend in the water, a blend of GPS and genealogy that one elder described as like your ancestor whispering in your ear through your pocket. The most promising experiments bridge pixels and participation. In Brazil's Xingu Basin, activists use drones not just to monitor illegal mining, but to overlay sacred river maps from Kayapo oral histories onto satellite images, proving tribal claims in court. In Nepal, a chatbot named Ganga AI answers pilgrims' questions about the goddess's myths while crowdsourcing pollution reports, turning prayer into actionable data. These tools don't replace rituals, they extend them, creating feedback loops where feeding the river's digital avatar funds real cleanup efforts. Still, the tension lingers. Does seeing a river goddess in VR make her more real, or more like a character in a video game? The answer might lie in who holds the controller. When Ojibwe game designers created Survivance, a water protector simulator where players resist pipelines through both protests and spirit journeys, they embedded teachings about reciprocity no mainstream studio would include, like penalties for taking too much water without giving thanks. Unlike shallow edutainment, these projects carry cultural weight because they're made by the people whose stories they tell. Perhaps the most profound use of tech isn't simulation, but amplification. In Bali, Hindu priests now live-stream melasti ceremonies where sacred statues are bathed in the sea to global devotees, who then organize local cleanups as acts of remote devotion. Australian Aboriginal elders use 3D mapping to document songlines along drying rivers, ensuring the next generation can follow the water's song even if the stream beds go silent. These aren't replacements for tradition, they're life rafts keeping ancient connections afloat in a digital age. So can pixels replace presence? Not entirely, but they might rebuild the bridges our disenchantment burned. When a child in Mexico City interacts with a holographic Chalchudlacu who weeps actual water samples showing pollution levels, the goddess isn't less real. She's speaking a language the child understands. The challenge is ensuring technology remains a vessel, not the destination, that we use it to wade deeper into the water, not just admire the reflection. Which brings us to the simplest tech of all, the act of kneeling by a riverbank, cupping water in your hands and remembering, with or without a screen, that what you hold was never just H2O. It's a beginning, an ending, and everything in between. Imagine standing knee-deep in a moonlit river, the cold current swirling around your legs like liquid silver. You cup your hands and lift the water to your lips, not just drinking but communing, whispering, thanks to the same force that ancient civilizations once worshipped. This isn't just poetry, it's a practice alive today. From Bali to Brooklyn, people are reviving personal rituals to reconnect with water's sacredness, one small act at a time. Take Sarah, a nurse from Chicago who began leaving wildflower bundles at the Chicago River's edge every full moon. It started as a whim, she admits, but now I feel this conversation. Like the river remembers me, or Javier, a former fisherman in Mexico City who now leads groups in pre-dawn limpia ceremonies, cleansing their faces with canal water while reciting Nahuatl prayers to Chalchudlacu. The water's still polluted, he says, but when you treat it as family, you stop being part of the problem. These rituals don't require grand gestures. A software engineer in Berlin marks each work break by tracing a droplet on her window, murmuring gratitude for the Spree River visible in the distance. A schoolteacher in Kyoto fills a bowl with tap water each morning, letting sunlight filter through it before offering it to her garden, a modern twist on Shinto Mizugori purification. Even children are joining in. A viral TikTok trend shows kids whispering wishes to storm drains, a bittersweet nod to the buried streams beneath their feet. The common thread: these aren't just habits, they're renegotiations of relationship, tiny treaties with the divine. But why does it matter? Asked Lena, who grew up near the Ganges yet never thought much about its sacredness until she began photographing its pollution. I started placing a single marigold in the water before each shoot, she shares. Somehow, the camera caught things differently afterward, not just trash, but the light struggling through it. Like the river was showing me its pain and its pride. Psychologists call this the observer effect of reverence. When we treat something as sacred, we perceive it more vividly, protect it more fiercely. Studies confirm that people who practice water gratitude, whether through journaling, art, or silent acknowledgement, report stronger emotional ties to conservation efforts. The ritual becomes a rope ladder, lowering us back into kinship. Yet for urban dwellers, the challenges are real. How do you honor a river you've never seen, buried under concrete and shopping malls? How do you pray to a watershed when your faucet delivers anonymous H2O from some distant reservoir? The answers are emerging in unexpected ways. Subway riders in London use meditation apps to send gratitude to the Thames during their commutes, visualizing its path beneath the tracks. Apartment dwellers in Seoul place bowls of rainwater on their balconies as miniature altars, honoring the Han River's lost tributaries. Even laundromats have become sites of ceremony. A collective in Portland slips biodegradable lavender sachets into washing machines, turning rinse cycles into offerings. The hardest part isn't starting, it's persisting. Modern life thrives on disconnection, on treating water as a background utility. But every time you pause to acknowledge the rain tracing your window, every time you pick up a candy wrapper before it washes into a gutter, you're casting a vote for re-enchantment. Because sacredness isn't just about grand temples or pristine wilderness. Greatness sits in the daily choice to see the extraordinary in the ordinary. When a fifth grader in Detroit told her class, "I don't litter anymore because the storm drain is the river's mouth," she wasn't reciting a lesson. She was describing a lived truth. That divinity flows both ways. You give attention, the water gives back presence. Now imagine your own ritual. Maybe it's sketching the puddle outside your door after a storm, or blessing your tea kettle before it boils. The form doesn't matter, only the intention, because when enough individuals start seeing water as alive, the culture shifts, laws follow, technologies adapt. And somewhere beneath the noise of cities and the weight of pipelines, the old gods stir, not as relics but as reminders that what we honor, we protect. And what we protect survives. Yet even as personal practices bloom, systemic barriers loom. How do these intimate acts scale to meet the thirst of megacities, the greed of industries? The answer lies in the tension between the two, because every movement begins with someone kneeling by the water, deciding to change. Rivers in cities face a paradox: they're everywhere and nowhere at once. Flowing beneath streets, trapped in concrete channels, or hidden entirely in underground pipes, urban waterways often become afterthoughts, their sacredness paved over by progress. Yet even in the most asphalt-covered metropolis, the pull of water persists. Take Seoul's Cheonggyecheon stream, a ribbon of blue resurrected from the grave. For decades, it lay buried under a highway, forgotten until engineers peeled back the pavement in 2005, revealing not just a waterway but a cultural nerve. Today, lantern festivals flicker above its currents, couples stroll along its banks, and elders dip their hands in its flow, whispering memories of a time when the stream was a living neighbor, not infrastructure. The project didn't just restore a river, it restored a relationship, proving that even in a city of 10 million, water can reclaim its role as a gathering place, a muse, a mirror. But Cheonggyecheon is the exception, not the rule. Most urban rivers remain in chains, straightened into flood control channels, poisoned by runoff, or shoved into tunnels like embarrassing relatives. In Los Angeles, the Los Angeles River is still mostly a concrete trench, its original bends and braids erased by mid-century engineers who treated it as a nuisance. London's Fleet River, once a sacred site where Celtic tribes made offerings, now gurgles unseen beneath pubs and parking garages, its name surviving only on street signs. The message seems clear. In cities, rivers are problems to be solved, not presences to be honored. Yet cracks in this mindset are spreading. Urban designers are beginning to ask not just how to manage water, but how to listen to it. In Singapore, the Bishan Ang Mo Kio Park transformed a sterile concrete canal into a meandering, plant-lined river, complete with floodplains that welcome monsoon rains instead of fighting them. The key innovation wasn't engineering, it was humility. By giving the river room to breathe, designers acknowledged its ancient right to fluctuate, to misbehave, to be. Meanwhile, in Copenhagen, the Engaveparken serves double duty as a playground and a stormwater basin, its sunken gardens filling with water during heavy rains like modern-day offering bowls. These projects don't just prevent floods, they perform a kind of secular sacrament, blending utility with reverence. Festivals, too, are stitching the sacred back into urban waters. Every summer, Vienna's Donaukanal hosts water lines, where projections turn the river's surface into a canvas for myths about river spirits. In Portland, the river huggers swim through the Willamette's once toxic currents, their annual plunge a defiant act of trust. And along the heavily industrialized Passaic River in New Jersey, activists organize memory boat tours, floating past factories while elders share stories of the Lenape people's vanished fishing grounds. These aren't just events, they're rituals of reconnection, proving that even the most wounded rivers can still hold meaning. The deeper question isn't whether cities can make space for rivers, it's whether they can make space for wonder. Can a storm drain become a shrine when decorated with mosaic tiles by schoolchildren? Can a bike path along a canal double as a pilgrimage route if riders pause to acknowledge the water's source? The answers are bubbling up in unexpected places. In Brasilia, a city built to showcase human dominance over nature, residents now leave flowers at the edge of Lake Paraná, where a statue of the water goddess Iemanjá gazes toward the skyline. In Pittsburgh, once synonymous with steel mills choking the Allegheny, kayakers now navigate water trails marked with plaques recounting Seneca creation stories. Perhaps this is the next chapter of urban rivers, not just rehabilitation but reconciliation, an acknowledgement that cities rise where rivers bend, and that divinity doesn't vanish beneath bridges. After all, even the most polluted waterway still reflects the moon. Even the most buried stream still hums beneath our feet, waiting for the day we kneel down, press our ears to the pavement, and remember how to hear it. Every 12 years, the banks of India's Ganges transform into the largest gathering of humanity on Earth. Kumbh Mela isn't just a festival, it's a pilgrimage where millions wade into the river at dawn, believing its waters turn to nectar when the stars align. Nuns in saffron robes chant as corporate executives in rolled-up trousers join them, all seeking the same thing, a moment where the sacred becomes tangible. Across the globe in Kyoto, Japan's Mizukurabe festival takes a quieter approach. Participants float delicate wooden cups down the Kamigawa River, each vessel carrying a handwritten wish, some for health, others for love, a few whispered apologies to the water itself. These aren't just cultural events, they're living conversations with the divine, where rivers reclaim their role as intermediaries between heaven and earth. The spiritual intensity of these festivals often defies explanation. Take Javier, a firefighter from Mexico City who traveled to Kumbh Mela after surviving a collapsing building. When I dipped into the Ganges, he recalls, it wasn't about washing sins. The water spoke not in words but in a knowing. Similar echoes ripple through Japan's festivals. Elderly women in Kyoto describe feeling the river's pulse beneath their palms during Mizukurabe, as if the water remembers their childhood prayers. These experiences aren't mystical exceptions, they're the rule for devotees, proof that ancient bonds with water deities never fully severed, just submerged beneath modernity's noise. Yet the tide of tourism complicates this purity. At Thailand's Loy Krathong, once a quiet offering to the water goddess Phra Mi Konka, LED-lit floats now compete with drone shows. Vendors hawk plastic, eco-friendly krathongs beside stalls selling river selfie backdrops. Even Kumbh Mela has corporate sponsors branding holy dips. The tension is palpable. When a sacred ritual becomes a bucket list experience, does it dilute the devotion or democratize it? Purists argue commercialism corrupts. Locals counter that tourist dollars fund clean-up initiatives and preserve traditions dying in nearby villages. The truth likely flows somewhere in between, like the Ganges herself, carrying both flower offerings and plastic wrappers in her current. What's undeniable is how these festivals adapt without breaking. In Bali's Melasti ceremony, where statues are purified in the sea, Instagram influencers now stand beside priests, but the elders simply adjust, directing them to wait until after the mantras finish. At Brazil's Festa de Iemanjá, devotees once threw roses into the Atlantic. Now biodegradable offerings are encouraged, blending ecological awareness with ancestral reverence. This isn't surrender to modernity, it's negotiation, proving spirituality can evolve without erasing its core. And then there are the quiet rebellions. Along the nearly vanished Rio Magdalena in Colombia, fishermen hold a festival of the forgotten, tossing handmade rafts adorned with photos of the river's former glory. No tourists come, no vendors bother, just a community mourning what's been lost, their grief as sacred as any celebration. These smaller acts may lack grandeur, but they pulse with urgency, a reminder that reverence isn't always about crowds and color. Sometimes it's a whisper against the roar of dams and droughts, which brings us to the unspoken shadow over all these festivals: climate change. As Himalayan glaciers retreat, the Ganges flow falters. Japan's cherry blossoms bloom earlier each year, disrupting Mizukureb's ancient timing. The next section won't just explore threats, it'll ask whether our rediscovery of water's sacredness has come just in time or far too late. Because festivals can honor rivers, but only if the rivers still flow. Climate change isn't just melting glaciers, it's unraveling the oldest stories we've ever told. Rivers that once flowed as deities now gasp in cracked riverbeds or rage through cities in biblical floods, as if the gods themselves are howling through the weather. The parallels to ancient myths are impossible to ignore. In Babylonian legend, the god Enlil sent a great flood to cleanse humanity of its arrogance. The Aztecs believed Chalchutlicue drowned the world when people forgot their vows to the earth. Today, we don't call these events divine wrath, we call them natural disasters. But the message feels eerily familiar. When you break covenant with the water breaks you in return. What makes this moment uniquely terrifying is that we're not just living through a crisis, we're writing it. Every myth needs its fools, its warnings, its tragic turns. Our ancestors carved theirs in cuneiform and hieroglyphs. Ours unfolds in real time, broadcast on satellite maps showing rivers shrinking to threads. The Ganges, once believed to descend from heaven, now carries Himalayan glacier melt like a fever sweat. The Colorado River, whose deltas sustain the Cocoppa people for millennia, ends in a dusty ghost channel, its water siphoned off for golf courses and almond farms. These aren't just environmental statistics, they're plot points in a story our descendants will recount with disbelief. Once they worshipped rivers, then they paved them. Then the rivers left, yet myths aren't just cautionary tales, they're blueprints for redemption. The same stories that warn of punishment also whisper of renewal. In Hindu tradition, the goddess Ganga purifies not just with water, but with the promise that even the worst sins can be washed clean if met with humility. The Maori tale of Tain separating earth and sky teaches that rupture can lead to rebalancing. These narratives don't just diagnose the problem, they prescribe the cure, remember. Repent, restore. Modern climate activism is already threading this ancient wisdom into its rhetoric. When Standing Rock protesters called themselves water protectors, they weren't just blocking a pipeline, they were resurrecting a role as old as civilization itself, the human who stands between the sacred and the profane. But here's where our modern myth diverges from the old ones. Ancient floods and droughts were framed as tests or punishments from capricious gods. Today's disasters are neither arbitrary nor supernatural. They're the direct consequence of treating rivers as plumbing instead of kin. The Mississippi River didn't choose to flood New Orleans. We straitjacketed its wetlands until it had nowhere else to go. This flips the script. We're not passive victims of divine whims, but authors of our own undoing. The question isn't whether we'll be judged, but whether we'll judge ourselves in time. Gender weaves through these stories in unexpected ways. Many river deities, from Ganga to Chalchutlicue, are goddesses, embodying water's dual role as life-giver and destroyer. Their myths often frame exploitation as a masculine sin. Kings who damned sacred streams faced their wrath, while healers who honored them received abundance. Today, that dynamic replays in striking ways. Women lead over half of global water conservation movements, from Kenya's Wangari Maathai to Brazil's Indigenous water defenders. Even in science, the term Mother Nature persists, as if the earth itself resists patriarchal control. Perhaps restoring rivers requires more than policy. It demands rebalancing our very relationship with the feminine, both in nature and ourselves. The next chapter of this story remains unwritten. Will we become the villains of our own myth, the civilization that choked on its greed, or the unlikely heroes who remembered the gods in the water just in time? The answer isn't in the stars, it's in the currents, the treaties, the quiet acts of kneeling by a riverbank and asking, "What do you need?" Because myths don't just tell us who we were. They remind us who we could be. Rivers have always been women, not by accident but by design. Ancient cultures from the Nile to the Amazon envisioned their waters as goddesses, their currents not just flowing but mothering. The Ganges is Ganga Ma, her waters a sacred womb. The Yoruba people know the Ogun River as Yem1ECDJ, her waves rocking the cradle of creation. Even the icy Danube was once Donu, a Celtic mother deity whose tributaries were her outstretched arms. This feminization wasn't poetic flourish, it was cosmology. Water, like women, was seen as life's first alchemy, capable of sustaining and destroying, of nurturing and demanding reverence in the same breath. Yet somewhere along the way, the caretakers became the controlled. Modern water management, dominated by engineers, policymakers, and corporate boards where men hold over 70% of leadership roles, treats rivers as problems to be solved, not entities to be honored. Dams are tamed, wetlands reclaimed, pollution mitigated, language that echoes colonial conquest rather than communion. The disconnect is stark. Where ancient hymns praised Saraswati's wisdom flowing like a river, modern hydrology textbooks reduce her to cubic meters per second. The goddesses weren't just forgotten, they were disenchanted, their sacred roles recast as sentimental relics. But feminism is rewriting that narrative. In Brazil, Afro-Brazilian women lead rituals honoring Yem1ECDJ, while fighting industrial pollution in Guanabara Bay, blending worship with activism. Along India's Yamuna, the River Sisters Collective, inspired by the goddess Yamuna's legends, monitors sewage outfalls while teaching girls to test water quality alongside reciting ancient stotras. These women aren't just reclaiming deities, they're resurrecting a worldview where water's protection is spiritual labor, a calling as much as a career. When Rukmini Rao, a Dalit activist, declared, "To clean the Ganges is to cleanse the patriarchy that poisoned her," she framed environmentalism as the next frontier of gender justice. The implications ripple beyond symbolism. Studies show water projects led by women have higher success rates not because they're softer, but because they prioritize long-term stewardship over short-term control. In Kenya, the late Nobel laureate Wangari Maathai linked deforestation to the silencing of river goddesses, her Green Belt movement replanting forests as acts of both ecological and cultural restoration. Meanwhile, Iceland's Reykjavik River Women, an all-female council advising on water policy, deliberately consult Old Norse sagas about river spirits before approving infrastructure. These approaches don't just include women, they center the feminine principle that once governed humanity's relationship with water: reciprocity over dominance. Could reviving river goddesses reshape power itself? The evidence bubbles up in unexpected places. When the Maori fought for the Wanganui River's legal personhood, their lead negotiator was a woman who cited the river as her ancestor. In Bangladesh, female farmers worshipping the goddess Ganga as Jal Shakti, water power, now lead protests against corporate water grabs. Even in the West, movements like Sister Rivers in Oregon invoke Celtic water deities to oppose fracking, their banners adorned with ancient symbols of Bridget's sacred springs. The pattern is clear. Where women lead with spiritual lexicon, policy follows not as concession but as realignment, yet the most profound shift may be internal. When young girls in Lagos learn that Yemletawani CDJ wasn't just a myth but a CEO, a deity managing an entire aquatic ecosystem, their career aspirations expand beyond the boardroom to the riverbank. When Peruvian schoolteachers explain that the Amazon's Mama Rio requires the same respect as a human elder, conservation becomes intergenerational duty rather than abstract activism. This isn't about replacing science with superstition. It's about remembering that the first hydrologists were priestesses, their offerings both data and devotion. The pollution choking these sacred waters isn't just chemical, it's existential. Every plastic-choked delta, every dammed gorge silencing a waterfall's prayer isn't merely an environmental crime, it's a spiritual wound. Perhaps that's why the fight to save rivers feels so visceral, because deep down we still sense that to poison a goddess is to poison ourselves. To dump waste into a river isn't just environmental negligence, it's blasphemy. Ancient civilizations understood this in their bones. The Hindu epic Matsya Purana warns that poisoning a sacred river incurs dosha, a spiritual debt heavier than any fine. Aztec priests executed those who fouled Chalchutlacu's waters, believing the goddess would withhold rains until the offender's blood balanced the scales. These weren't primitive superstitions, they were ecological ethics dressed in sacred language. When a 5th century BCE Athenian was exiled for dumping olive mill waste into the Elizos, the charge wasn't pollution but Asabaya impiety. The river wasn't just a resource, it was a god, and harming it was an affront to the divine order itself. Fast forward to today, and that moral framework has evaporated. The Ganges, worshipped as a goddess, now swallows 300 million liters of sewage daily, her sacred waters laced with chromium from tanneries. The Wanganui, granted legal personhood in New Zealand, still bears scars from decades of industrial farming runoff. Modern law treats these acts as regulatory violations, but through ancient eyes they'd be sacrilege, like burning a temple down for scrap metal. Reverend Tenzin Priyadarshi, a Buddhist eco-theologian, frames it starkly. When you poison a river, you're not just breaking environmental laws, you're severing prana, the life force that connects all beings. That's not illegal, it's karmic arson. Religious leaders across traditions are resurrecting this language. In Nigeria, Yoruba priests perform etutu cleansing rites along the Ogun River, apologizing to Yemletawani CDJ for oil spills as they scrub crude from rocks with bare hands. Pope Francis's encyclical Laudato Si calls ecological destruction a sin against God, while Hindu swamis issue fatwas against plastic offerings in the Ganges, arguing they violate dharmic duty. Even secular environmentalists adopt the lexicon. Indigenous water protectors at Standing Rock spoke of pipeline construction as desecration, a word normally reserved for vandalized graves. The haunting question isn't whether ancient cultures would condemn our pollution. They already did through myths that now read like prophecies. The Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh shows the gods sending a flood to purge humanity's filth. Japanese folklore tells of kappa, water spirits who sicken when rivers are polluted, dragging the careless underwater as punishment. These stories weren't entertainment, they were cautionary tales encoded with survival wisdom. When a Siberian shaman today warns that the spirits will leave if the rivers die, they're not speaking metaphorically, they're describing a measurable reality. Lose the sacred, and you lose the will to protect. Yet interfaith movements are weaving these threads into a lifeline. On the banks of the Jordan River, now reduced to a trickle by overuse, Jewish, Christian, and Muslim leaders jointly bless its waters each year, blending psalms, Quranic verses, and Torah readings into a single plea for healing. In California, Buddhist monks and Native American elders collaborate on water reconciliation ceremonies, pouring purified water into drought-stricken streambeds while chanting in Pali and Chumash. These aren't symbolic gestures, they're spiritual resistance. As Methodist minister Lee Shade observes, when you redefine pollution as sacrilege, you mobilize something deeper than guilt. You awaken shame at violating the sacred. The shift is subtle but seismic. A factory dumping chemicals into China's Yellow River might shrug off an EPA fine, but how does it answer to Hebo, the river god whose temple once stood on its banks? Can a mining executive draining Bolivia's sacred Pilcomayo look indigenous elders in the eye and call their beliefs primitive when those beliefs predicted today's ecological collapse? The verdict of history is already in. Cultures that desecrated their rivers didn't just offend the gods, they doomed themselves. The real trial isn't whether we'll face divine retribution, but whether we'll heed the warnings whispered in every poisoned current, that some lines were never meant to be crossed. At first glance, a Hindu priest performing arti with a Catholic nun on the banks of the Yamuna River seems improbable until you hear their shared mantra: "This water holds our prayers." Across the globe, an unorthodox alliance is forming between faiths that once seemed divided, united by the realization that while their theologies differ, their reverence for water does not. In Varanasi, Hindu sadhus and Muslim imams now lead joint Ganga Raksha patrols, monitoring pollution levels with the same fervor they once reserved for theological debates. Along the Jordan River, where Jesus was baptized and Jewish prophets once walked, Christian, Jewish, and Druze leaders have formed the Sacred Waters Covenant, using ancient texts to justify modern conservation. The Talmud's injunction against wasting water, Bal Tashchit, aligns seamlessly with Quranic verses praising rain as divine mercy, and we send down pure water from the sky, Surah Al-Furqan 25:48, while Hindu scriptures declare rivers as manifestations of cosmic energy, Rig Veda 10:75. These aren't just symbolic gestures, they're theological revolutions. The practical results are startling. In Malaysia, where the Klang River was choked with plastic, Buddhist monks and Muslim youth groups organized mercy flotillas, floating barges to collect trash while chanting sutras and Quranic verses. Their secret weapon, combining Buddhist mindfulness practices with Islamic Khalifa stewardship principles, creating a cleanup methodology where every piece of trash removed is treated as an act of devotion. Meanwhile, in California's drought-stricken Central Valley, Sikh Gurdwaras and Mormon churches collaborate on Langar for the Land, serving free meals to farm workers while installing rainwater harvesting systems, a fusion of Sikh seva, selfless service, and latter-day Saint teachings about tending the Garden of Eden. The theological synergies run deeper than shared charity. Christianity's baptismal waters mirror Hinduism's snan purification rituals, both frame immersion as rebirth. Buddhist water bowl offerings in Tibet reflect the same reverence as Navajo To-i-i-na, water is life ceremonies. When these parallels are weaponized for activism, the impact multiplies. After a 2022 oil spill threatened Thailand's Chao Phraya River, Buddhist abbots and Catholic priests jointly blessed containment booms, their saffron robes and white vestments mingling on the slickened water, an image that went viral, pressuring polluters far faster than regulatory threats. Yet the most potent collaborations thrive on friction, not just harmony. In Uganda, where evangelical pastors once dismissed Lake Victoria's local water spirits as demonic, a startling shift occurred when elders reframed conservation through biblical lenses. If Jesus calmed the sea, shouldn't his followers protect it? Now, baptism ceremonies double as lakeshore cleanups, with converts born again as eco-stewards. Similarly, along India's Narmada River, Jain monks famous for sweeping the ground to avoid killing insects now train Hindu villagers to filter microplastics, elevating nonviolence, ahimsa, from personal purity to planetary survival. The question isn't whether faith can save rivers, but whether rivers might save faith. In an era of declining religious affiliation, water stewardship offers traditions a chance to prove their relevance beyond dogma. When a Methodist church in Ohio installs a bioswale to filter stormwater runoff, quoting Genesis 2:15, "Till and keep the earth," or when Bhutanese monks map glacial melt using prayer flags as monitoring markers, they're not just practicing ecology, they're rewriting what sacred labor looks like. Which makes the next pilgrimage more than a journey, it's a homecoming. Because to walk the banks of a sacred river today isn't just to trace the footsteps of ancestors. It's to wade into the current of a rising tide, one that's dissolving the boundaries between temples and town halls, between prayer beads and water censers. And somewhere in that confluence, the old gods are stirring, not as rivals but as allies. For centuries, the world's great rivers didn't just sustain life, they guided it. Pilgrims followed their bends like sacred compass needles, tracing paths where water and worship flowed together. Take the Camino de Santiago, where medieval travelers didn't just walk toward a cathedral. They moved from holy well to riverside shrine, drinking from springs dedicated to forgotten nymphs and saints. The route's oldest stretches shadow the Minho and Sil rivers, their currents acting as both guide and baptismal font. Even the scallop shells pilgrims carried weren't just symbols, they doubled as cups for scooping river water, turning every sip into communion. These journeys weren't about reaching a destination, they were about walking with the water, letting its rhythm slow their steps and soften their hearts. Today, that ancient logic is resurfacing in surprising ways. Along England's Thames, a new kind of pilgrim now walks, not to Canterbury, but to clean the riverbank. Armed with trash pickers and biodegradable offerings, these modern wayfarers practice plogging, picking litter while jogging as a form of moving meditation, pausing at bends where Celtic tribes once left votive swords. In Japan, the Kumano-Kodo's forested trails now include stops to restore streams choked by landslides, blending Shinto water prayers with volunteer labor. The most radical twist, these pilgrims don't just seek personal enlightenment, they see the river's healing as part of their own. As one walker on Spain's revived Via Aquitania put it, "You can't separate the dirt in your soul from the dirt in the water." Scrubbing one cleans the other. The transformations run deeper than metaphor. On the Ganges' upper reaches, where glacier melt feeds the Bhagirathi River, Hindu pilgrims now join hydrologists to plant vetiver grass, a traditional purification tool, along eroded banks. Their Yatra for Yamuna walks merge devotional chanting with water testing kits, turning ritual circumambulation into citizen science. Similar fusion pilgrimages thrive in the Americas. Along Montana's Clark Fork River, Jesuit retreatants wade into restoration work, their silent prayers punctuated by the clatter of removing old dam debris. The line between service and sacrament blurs until it vanishes, but can walking truly mend what industry has broken? Ask the women of Scotland's River Dee, who revived the ancient Deeside Way as a pilgrimage route with a twist. Every mile walked funds the removal of 19th century fishing weirs that blocked salmon migrations. Their Strides for Spawning initiative has restored 8 miles of river and something more intangible. When you spend days following a river's curves, explains organizer Moira Green, you start dreaming like the water does. You notice where it's gasping. And you can't not help. This alchemy between journey and justice isn't new, it's ancestral. Medieval pilgrims along the Rhine left coins at crossroads shrines to fund bridge repairs. Today's walkers crowdfund dam removals. The Buddhist Sintamani Trail around Nepal's polluted Bagmati River combines mantra circles with trash cleanups, turning each piece of collected plastic into a bead on their mala strings. Even secular through hikers on the Pacific Crest Trail now volunteer as water guardians, monitoring desert springs with the same reverence once reserved for holy wells. The stories that emerge from these paths could fill books. There's the former oil worker who walked Ireland's Shannon River after his son's suicide, finding solace in removing invasive plants, unraveling my grief knot by knot, like the river untangles its own snags. Or the Kyoto grandmothers who trek the Como River's length each spring, scrubbing moss-covered statues of Kappa water spirits while recounting childhood tales to wide-eyed volunteers. Their walks aren't just cleanup routes, they're living storyboards where every bend holds a memory, every rapid a revelation, which begs the deeper question, is restoration work the new scripture? When pilgrims once copied illuminated manuscripts, they preserved wisdom letter by letter. Today's river walkers transcribe a different text, the water's own epic, written in sediment and spawning beds. And like all sacred stories, this one demands participation. You don't just read it, you wade in, you dig your hands into the mud, you let the current rewrite you. Because a river's truth was never meant to be observed from afar. It's meant to be followed one step, one stone, one story at a time, and what stories they are. Along the revitalized Los Angeles River, muralists now paint scenes from Tongva origin myths where the river stars as creator. In New Zealand, Wanganui Maori elders lead digital pilgrimages, streaming riverside storytelling to lock down audiences. These narratives don't just describe the water, they animate it, turning chemical spills into plot twists and dam removals into climaxes. Because if rivers flowed through humanity's oldest myths, shouldn't they also flow through our newest ones? The answer is bubbling up everywhere, from podcasts recorded mid-wade to children's books where polluted streams are characters begging for help. Perhaps that's the ultimate pilgrimage, not just walking the river's path, but learning to speak its language again. Not just restoring the water, but letting it restore us, because somewhere between the trash bags and the trail dust, between the water tests and the whispered prayers, a truth surfaces. We aren't saving the rivers. We're remembering how they save us, and that remembrance is spreading. Along the banks of India's rejuvenated Arvari River, farmers now host story circles where elders recount drought times alongside hydrology reports. In Chicago, urban pilgrims trace buried streams with groundwater detectors while rapping verses about the river goddess Chicago once worshipped. These aren't just exercises in nostalgia, they're acts of narrative resistance, proving that the best way to protect a river might be to tell its story so compellingly no one dares interrupt it. Which is why the next chapter of River Reverence won't be written in law books or labs alone. It'll be scrawled in trail journals, painted on flood walls, hummed into hydrophones lowered into the deep. Because a river without a story is just a ditch, but a river with a story, that's a god waiting to rise again. There's a quiet crisis unfolding in river valleys and coastal villages, one that doesn't make headlines but whose loss would ripple through generations. It's the fading echo of oral traditions, the stories whispered by elders that have carried the soul of rivers for millennia. In the Amazon, Tucano elders speak of Yurupari, the anaconda-shaped deity who carved the riverbeds with his body, his scales still glinting in the rapids. Along the Nile, Nubian grandmothers sing of Happy's laughter rising with the floodwaters, a melody that once told farmers when to plant. These aren't just tales, they're living maps encoding where the water runs sweet, where the currents turn treacherous, how to read a drought in the flight of kingfishers. But with each elder who passes without an heir to their stories, a library of ecological wisdom burns. The race to preserve these narratives is as urgent as any climate action. In British Columbia, the Secwepemc Nation's River of Words project pairs youth with knowledge keepers, recording not just myths but the subtle teachings woven into them, like how the coyote's laughter in a story signals a coming storm, or why certain bends in the Fraser River are called Salmon's Kitchen. Meanwhile, in Kenya, anthropologists work with Pokot elders to transcribe songs about the Turkwel River's moods, decoding metaphors that predict flash floods better than modern gauges. These projects aren't archiving folklore, they're salvaging survival guides. When a Maori elder teaches teenagers to chant the Wanganui's genealogy, he's not just passing down a poem, he's giving them the legal and spiritual DNA to defend its rights. Yet technology is becoming an unlikely ally. The Living Waters initiative in Australia uses holographic storytellers, recorded Yolngu elders, whose digital avatars recount Dreamtime water sagas in interactive museums. In the Arctic, Inuit communities embed QR codes along fishing routes, scanning them to hear elders' voices describe how the Copperman River's spirit taught their ancestors to navigate ice shifts. Even TikTok plays a role. Sami youth in Norway viralized joik songs about melting glaciers, their haunting melodies synced with drone footage of vanishing ice. This isn't nostalgia, it's resistance. As one Lakota language activist puts it, a story saved on a hard drive is better than one buried in a grave. But the stakes are higher than cultural preservation. When the last speaker of the Tlingit language died in Alaska, he took with him stories about the Copper River's secret ice highways, routes that scientists now realize were precise navigational charts for climate-induced thaw. In India, the extinction of the Bo language erased songs about the Andaman Creek's monsoon rhythms, leaving modern islanders vulnerable to tsunamis their ancestors predicted through verse. Each loss is a double disappearance, not just of words, but of the wisdom those words carried like vessels. Language itself holds clues to this vanishing world. The Maori word for river, awa, also means channel of ancestors, collapsing time into the current. The Bengali nad doesn't just mean waterway. It implies a relationship, something that nourishes and demands loyalty in return. Compare this to the English watershed, a term borrowed from industry, framing rivers as resources to be divided. The difference isn't semantic, it's existential. When a language dies, so does a way of seeing not just water as H2O, but water as kin, which makes the storytellers working today more than preservers, they're alchemists, turning oral gold into something the future can spend. On the banks of the dwindling Colorado, a Hopi elder teaches children to build story arrows, each feather representing a water parable tied to GPS coordinates. In Scotland, Gaelic bards compose new river ballads seeded with ancient flood warnings, their rhymes designed to stick like ancestral earworms. These innovations hint at a radical idea that the myths of tomorrow might not just survive but evolve, carrying old wisdom in new voices. The question isn't whether we'll lose more stories, we will. It's whether we can listen deeply enough and act quickly enough to save the ones that still flow. Because a river without its stories is just a ditch, but a story without its river, that's a ghost waiting to speak. Words shape worlds, especially when it comes to water. Consider the difference between calling a river a resource versus a relative. One frames water as a commodity to be extracted, the other as kin to be cherished. This linguistic divide runs deeper than semantics. In English, rivers are neutral, impersonal. But in languages like Spanish, the Rio Amazonas is feminine, carrying echoes of ancient river goddesses. The Maori language goes further. A wa river isn't just a noun but a genealogical term, acknowledging waterways as ancestors with legal standing. These aren't poetic quirks, they're philosophical blueprints. When a culture's grammar animates water, pollution isn't just environmental harm, it's violence against family. The consequences ripple through policy and perception. Hydrologists in Germany, where Die Elbe is grammatically feminine, historically advocated gentler flood management compared to English-speaking engineers who tamed rivers with brute force dams. In Bangladesh, where the Ganges is Ganga Ma, Mother Ganga, lawsuits against polluters cite matricide, a charge unimaginable in jurisdictions where water is legally property. Even children's books reflect this divide. English versions describe rivers as things that flow, while Ojibwe stories personify them as grandmothers who sing. The language we use doesn't just describe reality, it designs it, yet some tongues hold even subtler wisdom. The Andean Quechua word, yoku, means water but also life force, blurring the line between element and energy. In Japanese, Mizu no Kokoro, mind like water, teaches stillness through liquid metaphor. These frameworks resist the reductionism of Western science, where H2O is merely a formula, not a living presence. The contrast is stark. Where modern law speaks of water allocation, the Kogi people of Colombia describe listening to the river's needs. One system dominates, the other dialogues. Could shifting our vocabulary shift our ethics? Experiments suggest yes. In New Zealand, after the Wanganui River was granted legal personhood, news outlets began using phrases like, "the river complains," in pollution reports, language that spurred higher public outrage than clinical terms like contaminant levels. In Iceland, where glaciers are named like elders, a recent campaign to save the Okkakut ice sheet framed its disappearance as losing a grandfather, galvanizing protections unthinkable under sterile terms like ice melt. Even corporations are catching on. A Berlin water utility renamed its reservoirs rain cathedrals, cutting waste by 17% as users began treating taps with sacramental care. Children instinctively grasp this connection. Watch a toddler at a stream, they don't see H2O, they see a playmate whispering secrets to pebbles. Psychologists call this animistic thinking, but indigenous cultures might call it sanity. When Maori kids learn that spilling water requires an apology, not because it's wasteful, but because it's disrespectful, they absorb ecology as etiquette. Montessori schools mimicking this approach report pupils as young as 6 advocating for local creeks, proving that reverence can be taught young. The challenge now is unlearning before relearning. Urban dictionaries must make room for words like hydro-citizenship or the Bengali Jal Band who, water friend. Legal briefs could borrow from the Andes, where water crimes are tried as harm to communal life. Even graffiti might help. In Sao Paulo, artists tag storm drains with "O Rio Te Uve," the river hears you, transforming gutters into confessional booths. Because language isn't just how we describe the world, it's how we dream it. When we call a river they instead of it, we don't just change grammar. We change gravity, bending the arc of our actions toward respect. And somewhere beneath the concrete and the court orders, the old rivers stir, waiting for us to speak their true names again. Perhaps that's why toddlers and elders understand water best. One hasn't yet been taught to forget, the other remembers. Between them flows a current of possibility, waiting to carry us all home. Watch a toddler by a stream and you'll witness something extraordinary, not just play but communion. They'll chatter to the water, scold rocks for being mean when they trip, and solemnly offer leaves as gifts to the current. Developmental psychologists call this animistic thinking, but strip away the jargon and its pure, unfiltered reverence. Studies from the University of Cambridge reveal that until age 7, nearly all children instinctively attribute consciousness to natural features like rivers, describing them as alive or having feelings. In one experiment, kids shown a polluted creek drew frowning fish and crying trees long before they understood terms like ecosystem. This isn't naivety, it's a primal recognition of what ancient cultures knew. Water isn't just wet. It's watching. Parents worldwide are quietly nurturing this instinct. In Bali, mothers bathe babies in coconut shells filled with flower-strewn river water, whispering introductions to the local water spirit, Dui Danu. Scandinavian families practice friluftsliv, roughly translated as open-air living, where toddlers nap by babbling brooks to absorb their rhythms. Even in urban spaces, rituals adapt. A Brooklyn dad teaches his daughter to say hello to the East River from their apartment window, while a Tokyo mother folds origami boats with wishes for the Sumida River's health. These practices share a common thread. They don't teach reverence so much as honor a child's innate sense of connection before the world talks them out of it. Schools are catching on. Oregon's Stream Stewards program pairs classrooms with local creeks, where kids not only test water quality, but compose letters to the stream from the perspective of its resident frogs or herons. In Wales, students tending the Afon Dwinant build tiny river shrines with pebbles and acorns, blending science lessons with Celtic animist traditions. The most striking example comes from New Zealand, where Maori-led Awa schools have children recite their pepeha, a formal introduction that includes their mountain, tribe, and river before math or reading. You can't divide fractions if you don't know whose waters float your waka, explains teacher Hana Riweti. The results: students in these programs show higher empathy for nature and, unexpectedly, better conflict resolution skills. When you've apologized to a river for littering, saying sorry to a classmate feels trivial. But here's the twist: kids aren't just learning reverence. They're reminding us when a 6-year-old in Michigan refused to blow dandelion fluff because the river might choke, she mirrored the Hindu belief that airborne seeds carry prayers to the Ganges. A group of Australian preschoolers campaigning to save a pond cited their bond with Mr. Turtle, echoing Andean cosmovision where wetlands are kin. These aren't coincidences, they're proof that the sacred view of water isn't something we lose with age. It's something we're conditioned to forget, which begs the uncomfortable question: are report cards and standardized testing eroding what storytime and mud pies once cultivated? A UNESCO study comparing Indigenous-led nature schools with conventional systems found that the former produced not just environmentally aware kids, but happier ones. They don't see climate change as a problem to solve, notes researcher Dr. Leila Fernandez. They feel it as a family member in pain. This emotional literacy, this kinship with water may be modernity's most overlooked survival skill. So maybe the lesson isn't just for children, maybe it's from them. When a child tugs your sleeve to show you a smiling waterfall, they're offering more than childish wonder. They're handing you a lifeline back to a way of seeing that empires, industries, and curricula tried to bury. The same currents that carved canyons and cradled civilizations still murmur to those willing to kneel and listen. And sometimes the smallest hands hold the oldest wisdom. The cyclical nature of time whispers here. The same reverence we dismiss as childish might be the very thing that saves us, not as a regression, but as a return. Not to a primitive past, but to a perennial truth, that rivers were never just water, and we were never meant to be strangers. From the moment the first civilizations knelt by riverbanks with offerings, to the factories that now choke those same waters with waste, humanity's relationship with rivers has been a story of both devotion and amnesia. We began by worshipping these currents as God's Ganga descending from heaven, happy flooding the Nile with abundance, Tiamat's primal waters birthing creation itself. Then came the unspooling, empires that dammed and diverted, philosophies that reduced rivers to equations, industries that treated them as sewers. The sacred wasn't erased overnight, it was siphoned away, drop by drop, until we forgot the water ever whispered back. Yet the myths never stopped murmuring. They lingered in the way a child still talks to streams, in the stubborn rituals of elders who leave offerings at hidden springs, in the courtroom battles where rivers are declared legal persons. The Hopi prophecy, when the rivers die, we will know the end is near, isn't just a warning, it's an invitation, because the inverse is also true. When we revive the rivers, we revive ourselves. Every cleaned-up watershed, every dam removal, every lawsuit filed in a river's name is a step toward reknitting the covenant our ancestors knew by heart. This isn't about nostalgia, it's about survival cloaked in story. The old tales of vengeful river spirits weren't fantasies, they were ecological wisdom dressed in sacred garb. When the Aztecs said Chalchutlicue drowned the world for human arrogance, or when the Babylonians wrote of floods sent to cleanse corruption, they were encoding a truth we're now relearning the hard way. Disrespect the water, and the water will reset the balance. But here's the secret the myths held all along. The rivers never stopped being divine. We just stopped seeing it. So what now? The answer flows in two currents. First, the practical. Support indigenous water protectors. Push for legal personhood for rivers. Reduce your water footprint. But just as crucial is the poetic. Relearn how to see. Next time you pass a river, whether it's the Mississippi or a trickling urban creek, pause. Imagine it as your ancestors did, not a it, but a they. A being with a name, a story, a right to thrive. Greet it as family, listen, because the myths were never just about the past, they're compasses for the future. Now it's your turn. In the comments, share a water story, a childhood memory, a local legend, even a frustration about pollution. Let's build a new mythology together, one where rivers reclaim their sacred role. And if you felt the pull of these old gods, hit subscribe. We've got more mythic journeys ahead. As for the Hopi prophecy, let's rewrite the ending, not when the rivers die, but because the rivers lived, because we remembered, because we knelt by the water again, and this time we stayed.